Welcome to Inside the Vatican. I'm your host, Colleen Dulle. The Synod on Synodality is just around the corner, and one of the biggest questions in advance of the Synod was centered on who would be able to vote at it. The Vatican announced that at this Synod, women and lay people will be included for the first time as full voting members. Now, there's been some discussion about whether in this first session in October 2023, there will be any voting at all. It's possible they'll save that for 2024. But Father Lou Cameli has written a piece in the National Catholic Reporter arguing that if the Synod is not a parliament, as Pope Francis always says, then voting should be dropped. So today, Jerry and I are here with Father Cameli to talk about his article. And just by way of introduction, Father Lou Cameli is Cardinal Blase Cupich's delegate for formation and mission. He's a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago and has authored a number of books on theology and spirituality. So welcome from New Orleans, Father Lou.
Thank you, Colleen. It's good to be with you.
And you're joining us from Chicago?
I am.
And Jerry, you're here too. Good morning.
Good afternoon from Rome, Colleen, from sunny Rome.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. All right, Father Lou, let's set this up. So you wrote a piece in NCR arguing that if the Synod is not a parliament, then we shouldn't be voting. Run us through your argument. Why shouldn't participants in the Synod on Synodality be able to vote?
Yeah, it's a pretty simple thing. Basically, if we set up the vision that there's going to be some voting at the end of a process, whether it probably isn't going to be in the first session, but it looks like there might be something in the second. As long as that's on the horizon, my contention is that people will bring their various positions into play, argue for this or that, and it really undercuts, I believe, the basic dynamic of the Synod as Pope Francis has outlined it. The Synod, at least as I understand it, is really the Church learning how to be Church. And it is a continuation of a process that began with the Second Vatican Council. In fact, this is not in the article, but it's something that's meant an awful lot to me, is at the opening of the second session of the Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI addressed the whole assembly and said that the basic direction and dynamic of the council was he put it in a singular focus. It was the Church claiming consciousness of herself, knowing who she is so that she could be equipped in mission to go out. And that's exactly, it seems to me, what Pope Francis has envisioned for the Synod on Synodality. But if there's this prospect of voting, I think it's going to short circuit what the Pope hopes for.
Got it. Jerry, you've covered a bunch of synods. I wonder, can you, one, give us your take on this, and then two, give us some background here on how synod voting worked under previous popes and now under Francis? Like, how has this changed over time?
I remember perhaps before the year 2000, it was very difficult to get information first about what was happening inside. Even they called them recommendations to the Pope that were emerging. You really had to have some insider information to get it because it was not coming through the official channels.
And I guess we should pause for a moment to make clear here to our listeners that what is being voted on in a synod is usually these recommendations to the Pope. So there's all of this discussion, and then at the end they come up with a draft document, and then usually the bishops would vote on that document of recommendations paragraph by paragraph, and that's how they would come up with their official list of recommendations to the Pope.
So we had two things. We had what was happening inside in the synod and what we knew outside, or what we didn't know outside. Secondly, you had a very carefully controlled discussion operation inside, and you had issues which were being eliminated that couldn't be discussed. And I remember I think it was around when the African Synod was being held, and I went to Cardinal Lorenzi, whom I was quite friendly with, and who's still alive, by the way, and who was one of the surviving bishops of the Vatican II. He was a bishop at the age of 32 on the last session of the council. And he was president delegate, so he had a lot of power over the African Synod. And I said to him, can you agree to publish the recommendations at the end? And he said, it hasn't been done up to now. And I said, look, Cardinal, I've covered several synods, and I've always had all the recommendations, even though they were never supposed to be made available. And he agreed to do this. And this was a kind of a breakthrough from, one would have said, classified as a conservative cardinal. He went to the Pope, and the Pope said, okay. So that's not exactly on the voting, but it's on the climate around which. Then in the internal voting, we didn't really get to know what the votes were. Not from official channels, but again, you got to know what the votes from the unofficial channels were. And you could see there was polarization on some issues, but there was a majority and a minority, more than at the, as you said, Father Lou, on the Second Vatican Council. The final voting was pretty, wouldn't call unanimous, but good consensus was certainly there.
Really? Yeah.
In some of these synods, that was not the case.
And again, just pausing with a little context question. Is for a synod paragraph to be approved, would it be like a 2/3 majority, a 1/2 majority? What are we talking about?
Usually you're talking about 2/3. And cool. you go back to the Synod on the Family. That famous, the whole issue around the divorce and remarriage, it got through by 2/3, just over 2/3, but it got through. And that was seen at the time as a breaking point, or opening up point, I should say, because I heard senior cardinals saying, we're back to the spirit of Vatican II.
I want to throw a question to Father Lou now. Father Lou, you drew a contrast in your article between discernment and debate, and It seems clear that Pope Francis wants from this synod a group discernment like has almost never been done before, where everyone's coming together. And so your argument is that the fact of there being a vote would make people more inclined to debate rather than discern. I think that given the way that the synod is structured, it actually would be possible, as long as people are open, for there to be a legit discernment, and then for a vote to simply reflect, kind of the results of the group discernment. But, if you think that that's not the case, how do you think that the recommendations to the Pope should be made at the end of this?
Yeah, let me go back to that notion of discernment, because it's a word that is used by a number of people in lots of different ways. There's a certain amount of equivocation on it, because for some people, discernment is just another way of talking about let's figure out what's going on, and then out of that come to a decision, a conclusion. In fact, classically, discernment is really not a process of figuring things out, or even less arguing a position to arrive at a conclusion. Okay, clearly that. But it's not figuring things out. It is much more a process of discovery. The assumption is that there is a truth that is emergent in the reality of our experience, and that truth is there by God's gift and grace. And it's a question of being attentive and noticing, and in that a recognition, this is where God is leading us. That's a lot different than trying to figure things out.
So and I think that resonates with a lot of our listeners. I mean, we are a Jesuit publication, and a lot of people have a familiarity with Ignatian spirituality, Ignatian discernment, which is very much this process of discovery.
Yeah. And so I think that's really the hope. In a certain sense, this is a different kind of synod. If the Pope, as I understand it, is calling the church to this process, then now let's go back to your question, which was?
My question was, how do you think that recommendations should be communicated to the Pope if there is no voting?
I think if the body of the synod is able to allow for this larger sense of people sharing their experience, where they're drawn, the sensing the movements and so forth, and eventually arriving at a consensus, if you will, of value and conviction. I think that's how, and that can be brought to the Holy Father. Actually, the conclusion of that synodal discussion, as I would hope that it would happen, is that people coming from very different experiences and concerns would be able to say, oh, I see things differently now. That this is a different way of looking at things, and to hand that on to the Holy Father would be a very valuable service. I mean, very valuable. So it's not, I mean, I think if we stay with the category of recommendations, that perhaps it's not adequate. It's not up to the task of a synod on synodality.
That's an interesting distinction. Yeah.
So that would be my take on it.
Cool. Jerry, you've been pretty quiet. I want to know what do you think of this argument that Father Lou is making?
Well, I think Father Lou is absolutely correct. This is a new type of synod, which we've not had before. This is a new model of synod, because you will have people speaking for a certain amount of time. Then you will have prayer sessions, and then they come back out of their prayer and reflection and say what they felt about it. This is taking them down another road to the kind of one that has been walked through over the past 50, 60 years. So it is an experiment. Now, in terms of voting, I always go back to the conclave, because, and what Father Lou said about discernment, because the first votes in the conclave, they've been talking together for 10 days, and so having some kind of a discussion, discernment process. The first votes then offer them the possibility of discerning which candidate to go for, which direction to move for. So a vote can, in fact, be a real asset to the discernment at a certain point.
Yeah.
So I think we have to see. My feel is that they're going to try, at least for the first few weeks, to work without voting, to have topics, and there will be general topics, not single issue questions. There will questions of communion, of participation, and what is the other one? There are three. Mission, yes, those three. So I think what Father Lou is saying is correct, that we will have this attempt to go beyond the particular positions, to go deeper. And that's what Francis wants. He wants it to go deeper, to look at, really what is the basic ground or basis of the building that you're going to try and construct. What do you want there? And I think I think since the Second Vatican Council, we've not had anything quite as exploratory as we have in the Synod.
In my article, in my NCR article, I raise a caution because of what's happened in other Christian communities.
Right. Yeah.
When they've come together, and especially focused on the so-called hot button issues, for example, gender and sexuality and all that, it really tears communities apart. Because I think there's a lack of a prior experience
Right.
of the synodal church. So yeah, I mean, I'm just cautious. By
Yeah.
the way, this is so important, so precious. This moment that we're entering into. One of the things I'm thinking about is writing another article. Some time ago, I wrote a book about the devil,
Oh, yeah.
and yeah, it's I've written about Jesus, Mary, the Eucharist, faith, and all that. But what do people want? They want the devil. That's the
It's
bestseller
called The
of all
Devil
of them.
You
Yeah,
Don't Know, something like that.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a very simple thing. There's 4 basic temptations: deception, division, diversion, and discouragement. The 4 Ds. And whenever something good is happening, you can be sure that there will be some kind of adversarial presence pulling us off track.
And we've certainly seen
And
that in every synod that at least Jerry and I have covered
it,
together.
exactly.
Yeah.
And this one, I think, is very vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a delicate moment in the life of the church, and we have to be aware
Mm-hmm.
of the possibility of missing the truth of it all, of being divided from each other, of being diverted from our fundamental mission and purpose, and then in the end getting discouraged because it doesn't seem to be moving
Mm-hmm.
in the direction we want.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot at stake, and we have to be very careful as we go in. Not afraid, but careful, prudent.
Yeah, aware of the risks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think it's also important what y'all were saying earlier about how we don't exactly know what this process is going to look like. It could be that something
Right.
happens in the synod and maybe voting seems like a better idea. Maybe doing away with the vote seems like a better idea. But it so much depends on what happens in that room that we can't foresee. But Jerry, I wonder if you have any insight for us from your sources in the Vatican about, what they're thinking about in terms of voting. What's the latest?
Well, it's not clear. As I said,
Okay.
I've spoken to the 2 key persons in the synod,
Mm-hmm.
and what is very clear is that there is a real consciousness that this could really bring a seismic change in the church.
Jerry, did you just say seismic, like having to do with sism, or
Seismic,
seismic,
like
earthquake? Okay,
yeah,
okay. Just wanted to
okay,
make that clear.
sure. There are others who do think it will be
I
seismic.
know. Yes, there's that word
Seismatic.
gets thrown around.
Yeah, no. I mean seismic. I think that this synod has the potential to really bring this sea change in what happens in the diocese, what happens in the parishes, what happens at the universal level.
I want to raise one more kind of concern that I have about this conversation about voting, which is, Jerry knows this. Since we first started this podcast, I've been really focused on this question of why women weren't allowed to vote in the synod, and I was very excited to see that they would be this time around. And I think that everything y'all are saying about, the spiritual openness, this is all really important and really true. There's something that still rubs me the wrong way about the idea of, finally opening the vote to women, to, lay members of the synod, and then closing it and saying, oh, no, never mind. It almost gives a sense of like, well, no, it wasn't that important. That, yeah, it just rubs me the wrong way. I just wanted to raise it.
My comment on this is very straight. I think what is important is that women are a sizable block of the participants.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's as a member, as a participant, that the real influence takes effect. So I think that whether there will be voting or when there will be voting, I expect at some stage there will be. But it's the fact that women are in as full members in the working groups, in the plenary sessions, with equal voice to the Cardinal and the Bishop from God knows where. And I think that changes. You have the whole people of God, not just a hierarchy at work here.
Yeah, I agree with you. This lines up with the discussion being more important than the vote, which is what we've been talking about. Father Lou,
Yeah,
what did you want
exactly. I mean, that would be my own take on it too, that the voice even more than vote. I mean, the vote is a demonstration of maybe of some power or something, but the voice opens up horizons, allows us to take a look at things in a new way. The voices of these various people, women and others as well, lay people. So that's where I would hope that that would be prized and valued as
say?
an extraordinary movement in the life of the church.
But yeah, I think to go back to what we were talking about, so much depends on whether people are able to be open to that kind of transformative synodal conversation, really enter into this spirit of discernment rather than approaching it as a parliament, which I really think, Father Lou, is at the heart of your argument. It's something that we can all agree on, even if I don't agree with you on the voting thing.
Yeah.
All right, that about does it for our time together. So I just want to thank you both for joining me here on Inside the Vatican to discuss this issue.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you. Very good to see you. And thank you, Colleen.